Silentroom, a name that supposedly popped out of nowhere in the BMS world in 2017, and ever since has continued to steal the show in the rhythm game music scene, to the point where nowadays it's hard to play a rhythm game and not see its name at least once. And usually it's for literally the hardest song you ever play in your life. Known for its insane versatility, unique sound design, and beautifully crafted melodies and harmonies, it's needless to say it's at the top of the league, even if we transcend rhythm gaming. There have been countless requests asking for a video about Silentroom, and a large amount of them allude to the same thing. Where the heck did he come from to be able to create music like this off the jump? Well, what many people don't realize is that behind Silentroom is years of musical activity, including the majority under a separate alias starting all the way back in his childhood. He didn't just wake up one day and just start making things like No Control. There was a lot of trials, tribulations, and experimentations in his journey to this point. And that's what I hope to bring to light today, because as I'm sure you know by now, even the greatest started somewhere. As one of the younger artists in the scene, Silentroom was born in 1998 in Japan and grew up as a child that was surrounded by music. He regularly took lessons at a young age, which involved learning how to play the keyboard, as well as learning how to read and write musical notation. As he grew up, he also started playing video games, particularly around the time he was in elementary school. And as you can imagine, he became very fond of them. And as someone who seems to be quite musically inclined already, of course he was drawn in by the general gameplay aspects, but the thing he found himself getting really attached to was the soundtracks. He became fascinated by the way the melodies to some of these games were created to put up any atmosphere that you could imagine, happy, sad, or intense, as well as the diversity in genre of some of them. For instance, one of the games that Silentroom played was Grady's Free, and this game is cited to have one of the soundtracks he loves the most. No surprise there. For its time, which by the way was 1991, Grady's Free had an incredibly diverse and memorable soundtrack, and perhaps what drew Silentroom to it was its wide range of melodic expression and its ability to match each level to a T. Either way, Silentroom drew inspiration for things like this, and was inspired to begin playing around and creating his own melodies on his Yamaha Electone. Among Grady's Free, some of the games Silentroom is fond of in regards to their OST, and is influenced by to this very day, includes Kirby 64, Gran Turismo 2, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Blue Rescue Team, and perhaps more interestingly, the DDR second remix, Taiko no Tatsujin, and Donkey Konga Free. Is that a Donkey Kong Taiko game? That's right. It was only a matter of time before Silentroom would begin playing rhythm games, and once he did, he became obsessed. DDR was his main area of expertise, until time eventually came and Silentroom got a Nintendo DS. With that, he got Taiko Drum Master, and was immediately hooked. As you can imagine, playing rhythm games, especially Taiko, helped to develop his rhythmic intuition, and he drew a lot of inspiration from all the different kinds of tracks he heard in these games. Not only that, but eventually, Silentroom started playing around a lot with his computer, and from there he came across and started playing rhythm game clones online. Particularly, began playing Stepmania, OpenITG, of which he played a lot of Windy U and Tower Nuke charts, and Taiko clones. His background in rhythm games and general video games alike is surprisingly dense, and all this experience and inspiration was what naturally led Silentroom to begin taking composition a bit more seriously. When Silentroom was only 10 years old, yeah, he came across something that would change how he made music forever. MIDI sequences to be exact. This was the discovery that made him shift away from making music with just traditional instruments to making music on his computer. From there, he began to learn whatever he could about sequences, from a forum dedicated to making MIDI remixes of various Nintendo games, which surprisingly is still up to date considering how Nintendo usually operates. On this website was a tutorial that explained general things about sequences, gave some tips, and gave some suggestions for sequences to try that were completely free. For instance, Cherry, which was Silentroom's first ever sequencer, and was the one he used to compose his first ever computer composition all the way back in 2009. This was an almost 4-minute track, fittingly titled Passion. You can definitely hear the inspiration taken from video game music. A lot of the sounds used are similar to classic OSTs, and this is the kind of track I'd expect to hear from something like Kirby or something. Not something memorable or complex, but it's a good start. A very good start actually, because it's pretty insane that Silentroom produced something of this caliber when he was 10. 10. I didn't even know how to download a file when I was 10, and here we have Silentroom managing to operate a whole MIDI sequencer. And obviously he didn't just stop there. He later began to download as many MIDI music materials as he could to decipher how they were made, and by consequence he learned all about music programming. One of the materials he used was some concept music made for anything that was made in RPG Maker. Sort of like royalty-free music for if you were making games but didn't know how to compose. This was by an individual called Solil. No, not solely. And Silentroom took the MIDI files from this website and dismantled as many as he could, playing around with them and seeing if he could add anything himself. On top of this, he used pretty much anything he could get his hands on to get some sort of composing practice in, which includes making stuff in the DIY studio, in the Record Maker-matic, in WarioWare DIY. So not only does Donkey Kong have a rhythm game, but Wario also owns his own digital audio workstation. Apart from that being a cool fact, it just goes to show he truly did have passion when it came to songwriting, more so than almost any I've seen in the scene. And eventually, when he was 12, he would begin to branch out and upgrade his tools after learning about VST, which is what's used to create plugins to, for instance, emulate realistic sounding musical instruments or apply an effect to audio. Once he found this out, he began to use the Domino MIDI sequencer, along with a VST player called VST Host, to compose music completely free. At least for a short while, until he would feel rather limited by this. So sooner or later he would also end up buying FL Studio using his allowance, and completely self-taught himself on how to use it, as he always had. FL Studio thus became his go-to digital audio workstation, and it remains his go-to to this day. These upgrades saw a massive increase in the quality of the sound. To get an idea of how much his sound has progressed after only 2 years of self-teaching, this was the first song that Silentroom finished when he bought FL Studio. Mechanization, a beautiful sounding trance song which perhaps sounds the most rhythm gamey out of all the things we heard so far from him. The jump between passion and this is something that can't be put into words, and is emphasized further by the fact that he was, again, about 12 years old when this was made. Not only did this song mark a new era for Silentroom's music creation, since FL Studio is now in the picture, but this song also marks a transition into what he's known for today. See, as you may have noticed, up until now, Silentroom hasn't made any music for rhythm games. He mainly composed things that were completely unrelated for his own satisfaction. But eventually, the time would come in which Silentroom would discover BMS between 2010 and 2011, before mechanization was made. As you know, BMS is home to an incredibly rich history of music, arts, and narration, and Silentroom found out about it in the years that era-defining songs were released for it. Halcyon, Action, Conflict, Ultrasist. These are just a few examples of the things that Silentroom saw live in the flesh, and as you can imagine, he became greatly inspired by it. He saw that despite the generally short length of BMS music, there was a lot of musical expression and creativity involved. So he wanted to try challenge himself to create things like what he saw by himself. Some big inspirations he cites include Tara Labo and Sakjo, who at this point in time would have participated in the BMS fighters together, and he related to these guys in particular because they were all about the same age. And so, with a goal in mind, Silentroom began to self-teach himself how to create BMS. He learnt about the structure of BMS files, and how to deconstruct a song into key sounds to chart with through BMSE, an old but gold BMS editor. And eventually, he was ready to start making his own BMS, through which he wanted to immediately start by joining an event. All he needed was a name, because despite me referring to him as Silentroom, he didn't actually have an official alias yet, since he didn't release his music publicly. This is where one of the tracks he made just before mechanization comes in. It was a rather aggressive techno track that he felt evoked a sense of a monochromatic world, the color of which is probably like red with how this sounds. This track was called Monocube, and well, Silentroom thought this sounded pretty cool at the time, but what sounded even cooler was what he came up with from that. That which Silentroom would call himself over the next few years, Polycube. With that, it was settled. He made a Twitter under that same name, thankfully aged 13, or else he could have got done in for breaking Twitter law, and signed up for his first BMS event. The 9th, self-proclaimed anonymous BMS writer makes a statement. As a rough translation, essentially this was an event that gave more unknown BMS producers a chance to shine, and it's through this specific event that many talents were realized, including the now Polycube, because for this event, Polycube debuted in BMS with a quote-unquote art dubstep song, The Radiance of Cobalt, submitted on the 22nd of June, 2012. So yes, this is meant to be a combination of artcore and dubstep, and while you can hear the artcore part pretty easily, that being the piano and rather slow percussion, it is quite hard to hear the dubstep wobbles, which does take away from the song. But the idea is there, and it's a combination that was pretty unheard of at the time. Not to mention, I don't know if it's just me, but some of the wobbles seem very reminiscent of Parosia, which, I don't know, was just kinda cool. All of this resulted in generally mixed reviews and impressions. Many praised its unique combination of genres, but at the same time expressed dissatisfaction with the mixing, charts, and overall development of the song. It was still definitely a good start considering this was Polycube's first BMS though, and he got a surprisingly high place in terms of total score, gaining 8th overall. The potential was definitely there, and Polycube would fearlessly carry that momentum straight into the largest event of the year, the BMS of Fighters. Considering how legendary the 2011 BOF was, Polycube was jumping straight into perhaps one of the most anticipated and competitive BMS of Fighters up to that point, but he was more than ready to shoot his shot and show off his music to the wider BMS audience after the years of experience he had already. Polycube was joined by only 2 others, Mono and Monochrome, to create Team Monopoly. Mono, Monochrome, Polycube, Monopoly. Pretty cool, right? And together, those 3 alone created 3 songs. We had Dropout, which for some reason is marked as 0 and is completely black. I'm pretty sure that means it got disqualified, or I guess you could say dropped out, but regardless of whatever happened, it's a decent techno listen with a very catchy sample.
In 1961, they building up the wall. In 1961, they started another.
Next we had Artemis by Mono, a fast-paced song that combines elements of IDM with hardcore, hence earning the title of Intelligence Core, and having a very well-crafted melody to support this, including a beautiful piano lead. And of course, we had Polycube's debut to the BMS Fighters. According to the description on this song, this is made in response in some capacity to the impressions he received on the 9th Unknown Artist battle, citing that this was made while being aware that the points were not good last time. So in some ways, this can be considered as a sequel to the Radiance of Cobalt, BGA by Recreation, the song name, Dolize. The production value of this has soared from Cobalt. The bass wobbles have a much stronger presence compared to before. The song is much more dynamic, feeling like it's constantly changing rhythms and instruments, and the development of the song is generally much more sophisticated. Not to mention, this is more in the style of traditional hardcore, now that the breakbeats are turned up a degree. Considering this was submitted only 3 months after Radiance of Cobalt was submitted to the Knife's self-proclaimed event, for him to have taken that sound and enhanced it to this degree just goes to show how well he could take criticism and use it to his advantage. Even in this instance with Dolize, because of course, this song wasn't perfect. There was still issues with the sound quality and the mixing, and some even considered the song structure to be incoherent when this came out. But this was still a giant leap in the right direction for Polycube. It's also worth noting that this was a pretty big step in Polycube finding his sound. Notice that up until now, he hadn't stuck to any specific genre, but rather just made whatever came to mind and experimented with whatever inspired him enough to compose something. It's now coming to a point where we can associate Polycube with a consistent sound, and that sound is Artstep. For now at least. With all that being said, Polycube gained almost 45,000 points by the end of the event, which nets him 90th place out of the over 400 songs in the competition, and combined with the rest of his team, Team Monopoly ended up netting 54th place out of 143 teams. This already is pretty decent, but remember that Monochrome was disqualified and zeroed out. Who knows how much further they could have gone had that not happened. But still, this was a very successful BMS of Fighters for all of them with the release of these 3 songs, and Polycube made a strong debut into the world of BMS composition. You know what they say, first impressions are everything. Speaking of, Polycube didn't just stick to BMS now that he was active there. He also continued musical activities outside of this. For instance, a certain popular rhythm game was making its wave around this time, the beloved Sound Vortex Booth. And what Sound Vortex likes to do to get licensed music into their games is have contests. Having now had experience making songs for rhythm games specifically, Polycube thought it would be a good idea to try out for it. The contest in particular being the It's Summer, It's a Holiday, Independent Research Original Music Contest. As a rough translation, which is just a summer contest where you can submit anything you like. Despite it seeming like a much smaller, inconsequential contest compared to say the CAC song contest, it still had a lot of competition. A single glance at this list should be enough to tell you who Polycube was up against, and the songs submitted by them were all of very high caliber. As Polycube was still relatively new, he unfortunately did end up getting rejected, but the song he made, simply titled Callisto, was definitely something that, in some alternate reality, could have been accepted. Have a listen. A barrage of chiptune and dubstep, with his previous experience in Artstep shining through to create a section that I can only describe as being perfect for a Sound Vortex chart, only to then finish off with a brutal sounding hardcore section, the first of its kind we've seen from Polycube thus far. To me, not only does the song go dumb hard, but it's also a glimpse into another side of music production that us non-composers don't really consider. The amount of songs made behind the scenes that ends up not seeing the light of day because it got rejected from a contest or just because the artist didn't have confidence in it. That in itself is a testament to the dedication some of these artists have, and all it does is increase my respect for people like Polycube. That being said, Polycube also worked on uploading music to his SoundCloud, and some of the earliest works you can find on Silentroom's SoundCloud today are works that he dubs as being some of the very best from when he was 14 and 15 years old. For instance, Toe Mike. Again, taking on a dubstep influence, this time using a much more dramatic and climactic sounding melody, as well as an assortment of different instruments to create what I consider to be one of my favorites from Silentroom in this period. Interestingly, this actually stemmed from an EP, the Chikyu Yabai EP to be exact, released under a Dojin circle that may sound familiar to some of you, and if it doesn't, you do well to remember the name Unisphere. This was actually a circle created back in the winter of 2012 by Polycube and an individual who referred to himself as the Strayer, who you may know today as Meso. These guys have known each other since the 9th self-proclaimed BMS contest, and they decided to create a circle together with the plans of getting a bunch of other artists together every so often and releasing 4 compilation albums per year, each under a certain theme. It was definitely an ambitious project, especially for someone fresh to the scene like Polycube, but that didn't stop them from making it work. And by June of 2013, they released 3 albums, Nihon Yabai, Cyberspace, and Chikyu Yabai, which is considered the second installment of the Yabai series. Not only was Toe Mike released in Chikyu Yabai, but we also had songs like Frenzy of Sorrow by DJ Carrara, Too Hard Daily Life by Monochrome, the same one from the Big Master Fighters 2012, and a song that really caught me by surprise. This was the last place I would have thought Renatus by Solely came from, which many of you, including myself, probably know from it being Osa's starter song Once Upon a Time. Also one of my favorite songs I've ever heard in rhythm games, but that's a discussion for another time. Anyways, this was just a fraction of the work Polycube put in 2013, and the peak of his labor came through in the 2013 edition of the BMS Fighters. This was a special year for Polycube because of how he approached this event. See, him and his team from last year would return as Team Monopoly for the sequel, this time with 2 extra team members, Delivery and Kota Yamaji for background art. And as a part of this team, Polycube would actually end up turning Toe Mike into a BMS, officially confirming the intended genre of the song, which is Moomba Artcore. It's needless to say it was received very well, apart from small complaints about it being too long, and his teammates also pulled through with songs of their own, with Mono releasing Lights World, and the ace of the team, Monochrome, releasing Shirasuyu. This team ended up doing extremely well, gaining 148,000 points total and placing 17th total, which sends last year's placement out of this planet. But it did not end there. Oh no. Polycube was also part of another team, a team called Lad, that consisted of 4 members total, himself, Rek, 140, and 1B. Notice anything? Polycube was the only one that was going to be creating BMS. In other words, when it came to charting and composition, Polycube was a lone wolf. Now, it's only his 2nd year making BMS at this point. Surely the workload has had to have got to him at some point and decreased the quality of his work a little bit. Well, not only did the workload seemingly not faze Polycube, as his work remained consistent throughout, but by the end, Team Lad would end up outperforming Team Monopoly. He ended up making 3 songs for the team, Another, Enigma, and the ace song, Alice. Another was an EDM song that was his interpretation of the genre as a whole, doing his best to push the limits of your standard 4-to-the-floor electronic song, and in the process, creating a high energy track perfect for BMS. Enigma was the yearly art dubstep song, again being an extension to Radius of Cobalt and bearing some similarity to Dull Eyes despite being much slower paced. I feel like Polycube also nailed the short song structure this time around, as it feels much more complete. Finally, Alice was something a bit out of left field for Polycube at the time. It can be considered a standard breakbeat type of song, which wasn't something we saw from Polycube yet, but that's not what stands out about it. What really takes this up a notch is the sound design, and most importantly, the intricate chord progressions. This is something that you really begin to start noticing, that he hadn't shown off as much until now with these 3 songs. His ability to create melody and intertwine them in creative ways to create a unique harmony. Not only was this skill already at a fairly high level at this point in time, it continues to improve until the present day, where it's easy for it to be considered second to none. Not only did these set of songs outperform Monopoly by the end, but the team also ended up finishing in the top 10 by the end of the event, which is insane. Only 2 years in, and Polycube has set a standard so high that it's hard to believe if he'll ever reach that again, both in the perspective of his fans and Polycube himself. Shortly after this, in early 2014, Polycube had just entered high school, and shortly after, I guess maybe to celebrate, he wrote another song to submit to a Sound Vortex contest that was running at the time. Or at least he thought was running at the time. This contest was specifically the first Vortex character theme song contest, which had you create songs which suits the image of a proposed, completely new and original character that would then be created as a song jacket for the chart you would get in the franchise if you won. It was actually a really cool concept, and it was pretty satisfying to see all the different interpretations of the characters and their theme songs. Some, I guess you could say, more eccentric than others. All that being said though, despite the competition, to Polycube, it was worth a shot. Now, the problem lies in the closing date. The posting period for the contest was from the 24th of March 2014 to the 16th of April 2014. But remember how I said that shortly after Polycube entered high school, he wrote a song to submit? And in Japan, school usually starts around the second week of April. Bit of an overlap there, I'm afraid. Polycube completely misread the contest's closing time, and unfortunately ended up failing to submit what would have otherwise been a song that represented the image of the colours red and blue, perhaps in reference to the Sound Vortex knob colours. This song would then end up being added to Archaea several years later, unlockable in World Mode. Yep, you guessed it. What a perfect coincidence, because again, blue, red, and not to mention, laymen usually say Archaea is Sound Vortex, but for it does make me wonder what would have happened if, in an alternate reality, he did end up submitting red and blue to the Sound Vortex contests and became a winner. Early 2014 also saw a period of time where Polycube was beginning to experiment a little again, listening to a lot of different music and picking up the techniques involved. For instance, he enjoyed listening to the works of Nato, who in question grew his love for trance music, especially with his album Etude. Burmei Inazawa was also a big influence, whose musical expression proved to be fascinating to Polycube, and was one whom he learns the true potential of a technique called reharmonization. For those who don't know, reharmonization is simply changing the chords or melody of a song, but in regards to certain rules or ideas. The technical details are beyond me, I don't study music theory, but as a high level overview, a really common type of reharmonization you've probably seen is changing chords and harmony to make a song sound more jazzy. This technique becomes very important for Polycube, because not only does this make it easier to do things like remixes, but it also just makes creating melodies in general easier, since if Polycube were to now hear a melody that he quite liked, he could apply reharmonization techniques and get a completely new melody out of that without having to think of the melody from scratch. Basically, as any serious musician should be doing, he was broadening his horizons, and around that same period, he even ended up making a Vocaloid song, using Yuzuki Yukari, which was a pleasant surprise. This was called Koku Proof, or Thin Air Proof, a nearly 7-minute track, which is admittedly quite long, but I'm going to convince you in less than 10 seconds that every second of a song is worth listening to. It's pretty amazing that out of all of Polycube's work, no, out of all of Silentroom's work, this is one of his least known, despite having the soundscape that some can only dream of creating. Not only is the instrumental a masterpiece, even more evident from this section. But for what appears to be his first time making Vocaloid, Yukari was tuned extremely well. I'm not joking when I say that this completely caught me off guard. And frankly, this is way too underrated for you to sweep under the rug. I'm hoping. This also seems to have been created as part of a project of some kind, called the Chugakse Kompai 13, which just seems to be a Nico compilation playlist showing off musical talents that are still in junior high. Some of the works here are stellar, with Polycube and this one called Apathetic Girl by Kunimari being among the ones that really stood out. After this was a bit of a break from Polycube. He found that his workload in school increased, and he wanted to ensure he was focusing on his studies, so that ended up cutting into his time to compose music, and even more so into his time to play video games. So much so that by high school, he rarely played video games at all. He only really stuck to schoolwork and working on music when he got the chance, and all those chances he got would lead up to the BMS of Fighters for 2014, or in this case, the Go Back to Your Roots 2014. After a very successful year last time, Polycube was ready to approach the summit this time, and he made it his objective to get the highest score he possibly could in the BMS of Fighters. With this, he returned again with the OGs, Monochrome and Mono, for Team Monopoly's third BOF year straight, and here they were joined by support members Kaida, Salita, and Kazeto for BGA, vocals, and illustration respectively. Now, This year was a bit of a turning point in regards to Polycube's feelings towards the idea of BOF and music composition in general. In fact, a certain feeling has been building up since the very start of him making BMS, and was beginning to hit its peak whilst composing for his submission this year. See, it's no secret that the BMS fighters' rankings are sometimes never representative of the actual quality of a song. Rather, because of the event's system of ranking using impressions, the high-ranking artists of a competition are sometimes only there because they're just that popular. This is a long-standing controversy of BMS events in general, but especially in something as large as the BMS of fighters, and it even goes so far that sometimes the BOF is reduced to being called a popularity contest. The smaller artists are obviously the ones who suffer the most from this rather cruel aspect of the event, and Polycube was arguably among the small artists, or rather at the very top of the small artist bracket. In fact, he's one of the artists that managed to break through to near the top from his work quality alone, alongside the members of Team Monopoly. But Polycube was aiming for the very top, and this would mean having to outshine the likes of Psy, Leaf, Void, and many composers who've been in the game longer and are just inherently more popular. Combine this with the possibility of getting impressions that are low for the sake of being low, to try and harm an artist's chance of winning, and you have what could very quickly make for a pretty rigged system. A real the rich get richer and the poor gets poorer type of situation. Therefore, it's never really in your best interests as a participant to try and aim for a certain place or aim for a certain number of points, since it's so far out of your control anyways. But if you recall what I said a few minutes ago, and he made it his objective to get the highest score he possibly could, this is where Polycube made a fatal mistake that would end up being a detriment to him for the next few years. For each passing BMS event he participated in, he became more and more competitive in regards to placements, and this reflected in each work he subsequently put out for them, to the point where his musical style would become more dark and have a much more oppressive style. The song he produced for this year's BOF, Agito, a collaboration with Kaida, who also goes by Alpha Complex, was a byproduct of the feelings that all of this was given him. Despite what I just said, it was an uplifting sound that explored his changing feelings towards his passion of making music by going back to his roots and acknowledging his love for that same passion. This was a song that represented the initial excitement that comes from doing something for the first time, namely that initial feeling of passion and excitement you get from it, with the spaceship in the video representing that, since the ship is actually returning to its origin. It's a BMS that stayed true to the theme of the event, whilst challenging his own feelings of love for composition. And it ended up getting stellar impressions, finishing 13th by the end. The rest of his team also performed well as usual, with Mono releasing Harder Experience, and Monochrome releasing Kindly Breeze, which featured vocals from Salita. And by the end of the competition, Team Monopoly placed 9th. They finally did it. They finally managed to breach the top 10, and while this was an exceptional team performance, to Polycube, he didn't think he did well on an individual level, and the stress of trying to score high would carry on to curse him until next year in 2015. To grossly simplify, long story short, Team Monopoly returned yet again, and Polycube's work for the year was Last Morn, whose concept was actually started just after the ending of Go Back to Your Roots. This was a song that was based on the ideas of finality, the things that you would do in your last days of living, hence the name Last Morn for a last morning. The concept was actually influenced by a Danish poem about a poet who was at the brink of death. I really don't want to butcher this title, but the English name is usually called A Poet's Last Song, despite not translating directly to that. The poet reflects on the life God has given him, thanking him for allowing himself to walk a path commanded by God, and he says goodbye to the things he holds dear in life, leaving the ending up to interpretation. Polycube then took ideas from this and fused it with electronic music, which, by the way, was inspired by people he looked up to musically, the biggest of which being Camellia, since he took a lot of influence from his Kokoro no Shitsuro. This resulted in a beautifully woven song, whose harmonies are perfect for a final and emotional send-off, one that isn't full of regret, but rather that reflects happily on a life that had purpose. The background art is one that brought image to some of the lines in the poem. For instance, this scene matches up with this line, and needless to say, 140 did a great job on this. Unfortunately, by the end of the event, he ended up regressing from last year down to 17th place, which was less than ideal to an already competitive Polycube, and this crushed him. After all that hard work, he still ended up making little progress to his goals, he thought. Because of this, he ended up falling into a depressive state in regards to his music, struggling to get back into a positive approach to composition, and detaching himself a little from it as a result. But rather than completely withdraw, instead, he took a step back and began to listen to as much music as he could come across, as in thousands of songs on SoundCloud, with a majority of them being electronic music and chiptune. Polycube was also part of his high school choir at the time, where he often sang the bass, all of the lowest notes, which is the base of harmony in and of itself. Both of these experiences helped to cultivate his musicality while he was down. Through this, he discovered that one of his biggest strengths when it came to composition was indeed his sense of harmonic balance, which he attributes to his experience in using a technique called voice leading in choir. A song that was a byproduct of this period of time was Kono Oshi no Uede, which you may know from Rainbow Frontier. And this song was actually inspired by a friend of his, Lime from Unisphere, introducing him to the kawaii core genre, which I actually haven't heard of myself until just now. Either way, this song in particular was his take on a kawaii core song, crafting his melodies from songs he's heard previously in his life, including a very prominent one from his childhood, Gusty Garden from Super Mario Galaxy, in an attempt to recall the old and honest feelings he had for creating music. But this just wasn't enough. In fact, maybe it never would have been enough if he continued under his current trajectory as Polycube. Not only did he want to try and leave his past competitive self behind, he also wanted to challenge the doujin music culture surrounding rhythm games as a whole. Since it was around this time that he thought rhythm game music was starting to shift to uninspired copies of other tracks. If you've ever felt that songs in rhythm games all sound about the same, around 200 BPM, very similar in terms of sound, generally things considered cookie cutter rhythm game wise, this was what Polycube felt. And he quotes, thinking at the time, "There are so many better ways to do it. I just wish more people knew about them." And so, Polycube left his alias behind, with the last time Polycube was seen being in the 2016 BMS of Fighters in Team Megalo Pulse with his song Wondertainer, which, by the way, is a big step up from last year in my eyes, and is so underrated it hurts. It's a song that had all his energy put into it for one final send-off to a part of what represented his reasons for living. Once the final act of Polycube was finished, the question was, what would his new alias be? Well, he always made music with headphones instead of speakers because he didn't want his family to hear his music, and his goal has always been to fill silence with the colors of pure musicality. He wants to make music in a quiet room, and he wants to fill the grey of silence with color. A silent room. This was an entirely new chapter. He completely rebranded, changing aliases on his SoundClouds and Twitter, and he started doing what he did best as soon as he could. But funnily enough, when he came up with the Silent Room alias, the first song he created after didn't even end up being under Silent Room, nor did it end up being under Polycube. See, in spring of 2016, Silent Room ended up getting to know someone who you may be familiar with, Shun, represented by this kanji character. Silent Room saw this video that Shun made for a song in Friends 2015, and he really enjoyed it, and it turned out Shun was also a fan of Silent Room's work, so they contacted and started working together, with their first appearance being in the event Genre Shuffle Tree, probably my favorite BMS in terms of rules. To put it simply, if you sign up for this contest, you have the right to remain silent about your choice in genre, because the genre you compose in is actually selected by a random number generator. This could end up being something really nice, like trance, or it could end up being something that low-key sets you up for failure from the get-go, like atonal music. Shout out Psy. Thankfully, the latter did not happen to the duo, and they landed a pretty comfortable Juliana techno slot. I've never really known what Juliana is, despite seeing it mentioned as a genre a lot, but I assume it's a derivative of Cranky's Julia series of songs. Considering Silent Room's already extensive background in things similar, like trance and dubstep, it was something to look forward to. And to put the icing on the cake, for this event, he went under the alias Bang Bang Accounts Creating Man. Why? No idea. I don't even think he knows, but it is funny. And so, with Silent Room on music and Shun on background art, they ended up submitting a song called Alt Futur. This was a song that took the Juliana aspect and combined it with high-tech, which is a genre you may recognize as the specialism of artists like Lapix and Korske. The energy of this track is higher than it's ever been. This would definitely be perfect for a rave of the highest order, and my suspicion of a cranky genre may have been confirmed, considering there's a melody that sounds similar to Party For You, and it generally seems to take a lot of inspiration from cranky style tracks. This was really starting a new saga of music creation off of a bang, and ended up winning the whole thing decisively, being the only song that scored above 200 in the competition. If this wasn't a good omen for what's to come, then I don't know what is. Around this same time, Silentroom started a new project on Unisphere, which, by the way, has stayed consistent throughout this entire time. But this would end up being a big project that brought him connections to people outside of the BMS world, including, briefly, the legends that had just taken the world by storm, Toby Fox. That's right, to celebrate the first anniversary of the game, Underveil was going to be a compilation album of arrangements of different songs from Undertale's soundtrack. I think it goes without saying that Undertale's soundtrack is down in history as a musical masterpiece, and because it focuses more on melody and leitmotifs rather than instrumentation, this makes it really versatile when it comes to making music, kinda similar to Toho, and its seemingly infinite potential in remixing the soundtrack. This also meant that there was a lot of room for all sorts of different artists to join in on the fray, from BMS artists specializing in high-paced music, to those that focus on traditional video game music, whether that uses chiptune or classic instruments. Silentroom was the leader of this project, and balanced this with BOF as well as his schoolwork. In fact, this was around the time his university entrance exams were approaching, so he found it hard to balance his time. But he pulled through in the end, creating a successful project and having another year in the BOFU 2016 as Polycube. Underveil itself is honestly a beautiful project that spans a variety of genres and has some very unique interpretations of some of the stuff found in Undertale. For instance, the song you hear in the background right now is by Daff, who transformed both Heartache and Stronger Monsters into crazy good video game rock using a variety of instruments. The violin, the flute, the guitar takes the floor for a solo at some point. That sort of ordeals alone should give you an idea for the caliber of music put together in this project, and I highly encourage you to check out the project on Silentroom's channel, since it would probably take a whole video to go through everything. That being said, Silentroom himself made a track that remixed Last Goodbye into a happy chiptune hardcore song, calling it Never Again, a fitting name for the end of a project filled with so much emotion and story. It wasn't long after this, in early 2017, when Silentroom got a new PC, thanks to supporters on Patreon, which boosted his computer performance by an order of magnitude. To give you an idea, for my fellow computer nerds out there, his CPU alone went from a Pentium E6300 to an i7-7700. Pretty big jump, and this improved his mixing and general production greatly. It was all starting to look up for Silentroom. Everything was slowly starting to fall into place to really take his music career to the next level, and he was slowly starting to recover his genuine love for creating music once more. Then, in May of 2017, something happened that would deliver Silentroom to the light he'd been searching for. In that time, an offline event was held called Underveil The Real. Essentially, this is where he got together with the people he worked with, along with guest visitors in the party room, and had a listening party of Underveil. This was very special for him, because it was the first time he finally got to meet with the people he had only spoken to online in previous years. Now, this offline event was planned by Eston, who also contributed to Underveil, and it was his idea to create a little surprise for Silentroom. To thank him for managing such a project, the Underveil arrangers got together in secret and created a medley for Silentroom, each providing a small remix snippet of Last Goodbye, and they subsequently revealed this to him in the event. This was Underveil. It's real, and we are Underveil. Wow. I almost want to cry tears of joy from how beautiful this is, and I'm not even the recipient. Without a doubt, this is one of the most heartwarming moments I've ever seen, and Silentroom took this into his own heart too. Not only did it bring him an overwhelming feeling of reward and recognition for all the hard work he's done over the years, but most importantly, it also brought his old feelings back, the one he longed for. The joy of music came back to him as he began to understand that music wasn't about being competitive and winning contests. It was never about who has the highest numbers, but rather about expressing yourself and your emotion. Or well, at least he thought so, and I'm inclined to agree. Later on, he responded to this gift in kind with a secret medley of his own called Afterglow. Did you really think it was over? And in this, in a very similar style to Never Again, he made a song that provided an eternal message to each and everyone that helped him on the project. Underveil will carry on to see 3 more additions to it in the coming years. The sequel, the extra, and the future. Each is great as the last. Again, do be sure to check these out. And with that, the BMS Fighters Ultimate 2017 approached. Silentroom knew that he would get much busier in real life next year, so he came into this BMS Fighters with the intention of it being his last, his final challenge before he would move on to new chapters. The end was nigh, and he wanted to put everything he had one last time into his music, especially with his newfound passion. It would be a lie to say he didn't want to win this contest, of course, but what mattered more was making music he was proud of. Either way, it was his last chance. And so, for the first time since 2013, Silentroom signed up into a solo team, naming the team after himself. He was joined by several others for support, including Shun, the person we saw previously in Genre Shuffle. But in terms of music, he was all alone. And with that, he made 4 songs that you guys are probably very, very familiar with by now. Each of these songs are songs that represent a part of him over the years. Everything that Silentroom has faced so far felt like it led right up to this very moment with these 4 songs. Let's start with Finxie. Finxie is a happy chiptune song that represented his childhood love for video game music. The title itself is a word coined from 3 words: finale, finite, and phoenix, which also explains the imagery in the BGA, an unidentified object soaring through the skies towards what Silentroom describes as flying towards the afterglow of the end of our long existence. By the way, each track has its own title associated with them that explains the theme of the song. Take those titles as you will, along with what I'm saying to you. Anyways, Emo, the background artist, did a great job interpreting this and putting it together. And this is definitely one of Silentroom's most beloved tracks because of just how happy and nostalgic it makes you feel. Not to mention, the song's BPM is 222.22. Sound familiar? The next song was Implex Rough. This was actually a remix from a song that came from a BMS event back in 2013, the Non-Genre 2, which was hosted by Silentroom himself while he was Polycube. The song in question was a piano-only piece called Rough by Mommy, and it's definitely a standout piece among the classical BMSs you can find. It has a very memorable lead, and Polycube liked it so much that he decided to do a remix of it. This is a song that's a mix between technicality and excitement, and is a song that represents the conflict he feels about the direction rhythm game music was heading in. Man, I really love this though. Surprised I rarely see it around in the more popular rhythm games. Next was Game Boy, arguably the most underrated one. This was a piece expressing his love for video games. Not his love for video game music, which was Finxie, but rather his love for simply playing them and being a gamer from childhood. This, in similar fashion to Finxie, is a beautiful and nostalgic track, but with a much slower and mellowed out pace that brings emotions I can barely even put to words. Not to mention the animation here by Shun is of a caliber almost unseen in BMS. Holy fucking shit. I cannot believe that this has the least views out of all 4 songs. The one that has the most though, well, this is a song that completely flips everything we just heard on its head. We go from a happy, magical, emotional experience and are plunged straight into the darkness, the unknown, and into fucking brutal sound design. I don't even need to say its name, do I? You may have already guessed, but Nhelv is a track that represents all the negativity Silentroom experienced over the years in regards to his music. Frustration from the lack of expression he found in rhythm game music today, frustration from not meeting his own standards and scoring goals during events, and most of all, pain. The pain of losing his love for creating music in exchange for an unhealthy competitive mindset. This was the culmination of it all. Not only is this, frankly, the best neurofunk I've ever heard, the background art is also exceptional, with Shun coming through again. I like to think of this entire animation being a representation of the chaos of all these negative aspects. But really and truly, Shun made this with the intention of creating something that felt otherworldly and seemingly nothing else. Silentroom himself says only this in regards to the entire thing in his description: to study, to hone one's nerves, to clear one's senses, to encounter the beauty of a single melody spun from 1,000 miles away, to devote all one's skill to encountering its beauty. This is the supreme happiness allowed to creators. As a rough translation, this draws a parallel to Silentroom's story thus far. He was inspired by the beauty of the melodies he heard in things like video games, as well as when he started exploring elsewhere, and he devoted his skills to be able to one day encounter a melody as beautiful as that on his own accord. It's a clear contrast to the things represented by Nhelv, showing how Silentroom has changed from his negativity and how he found happiness in his composition. 4 behemoth level tracks, 1 Silentroom, and a team of background artists. It was a sight to behold, to say the least. Not to mention it didn't stop there, because he also made 2 more songs on separate teams, one with a hidden alias, the Bang Bang account creation man from before. His work rate was simply on a different level this year, but it all made sense. Years of making music, years of hard work, years of shooting for the summit, and years of failing led right up to this moment after all. And once he released these songs, his 4 main ones climbed higher and higher and higher in points with each passing week, until before he knew it, every single song on his team surpassed 100,000 points, with Nhelv breaking the competition by exceeding 250,000. But the question is, was it enough? Well, just look for yourself. And so, Silentroom did it. He'd accomplished the goal he had for himself for so very long, and it felt like a huge weight that was there for years had been lifted off his shoulders. Hard work really does pay off, and this was the beginning of a streak of success in his career. But before that, he took some time off, beginning to indulge in some of his other hobbies, like playing video games, which he hadn't done for a long time. And after then entering college the next year, his music production gradually slowed down. This didn't mean he quit. As a matter of fact, he had a newfound production policy now that he was out of the competitive mindset, and that was energy for every piece he made. Energy that at the very least conveys the love and interest he has for music. And so, over the next few years, he takes his crown and he runs with it. I could go on about all the things he ended up doing as a result. His music starts being put in mobile games, notably La Nota and Archaea. He participated in the Go Back to Your Roots 2018 and dropped one of the hottest and most memorable songs of his career, Null Control. In April 2019, he ended up releasing his first ever album, Rainbow Frontier, an album that summarized the best work he made both with Silentroom and his Polycube. He won the grand prize for the Archaea Song Contest in 2020 in collaboration with Frums, who met them in 2018, with the insanity that is... And in 2021, he collaborated with Saber and Billy Moto to create a brutal MWC 4K Grand Finals tiebreaker map, Purple Palace. Shoutouts to Silly Fango for managing to FC this straight after winning the entire tournament. This year was also the last known time he participated in BMS, as of recording, with Team Clue, which honestly I think might deserve an entire video in itself, so maybe stay tuned for that. And finally, we're up to 2022. In an almost fitting closure, he submitted a song yet again for a Sound Vortex contest, this time submitting for the 10th CAC contest, which, as you could guess, was an extremely competitive and high profile one, since KAC, or the Konami Arcade Championships, is Konami's biggest annual event that showcases the best players of the world when it comes to Bemani games like DDR and Sound Vortex. But that didn't matter. Silentroom was well beyond the days of Polycube now, and well, what goes around comes around.
ファイナリストの目の前にある筐体だけが知っています。
In the end, it all comes full circle. His music can now progress to a point where he has a very recognizable style. His way of melodies and harmonies was almost second to none in the scene. His sound design hit an ingenuity that hadn't been seen before, and frankly, he had now progressed to being considered by many as one of the greatest artists to touch rhythm games. Which is why, in April of 2022, when it was announced that a new album from Silentroom would be released, thousands could hardly contain their excitement. The last known work of Silentroom would be released on the 24th of April, a 2-disc album that was not only a summary of his more recent works, but also an opportunity for more tracks, as well as remixes from other artists. In My Heart. This album to me is the definitive Silentroom experience for any new listeners to him, and the best part is that there's a lot of choice. Whether you're looking for Silentroom's signature happy chiptune melodies like In My Heart, or for more mellowed out tracks like B9 Syndrome, my personal favorite, or for extensions of beloved tracks like Random or Aegleseeker. It's all here, and you can tell with each track the amount of heart and soul poured in by everyone involved. Please, do take a listen when you have a chance. Maybe even buy the album. It helps Silentroom out a whole lot. Anyways, all that's to say, not long ago, Silentroom announced going on a hiatus. It's unknown for how long. He could end up coming back tomorrow, or In My Heart could be the last thing we hear of Silentroom. But whatever the case is, Silentroom has left such a profound impact on the rhythm game scene with his music, inspiring thousands of people like you and me to pour our emotions into the things we enjoy, and to never lose sight of what's important despite all the hardships we may end up facing, to make yourself proud and live life with no regrets, no matter who or what tells you otherwise, to surprise yourself and do the impossible, so you're able to look back and do nothing but smile. Every note, every melody could tell a million stories. Silentroom told us his, and in light of his retirement, I sincerely wish him the best, and I hope he finds deliverance in whatever he's pursuing for the future. Thank you for your music. Finally, a note from the legend. I'll be taking a hiatus from music for a while. This is for the sake of my main career. From now on, besides producing music, I would like to continue to play my favorite games, and try other creative activities besides producing music. I will spend my time peacefully and slowly. I promise to continue to create works of art, and I hope that by continuing to create at a comfortable pace, I can pass on the ideas I received from the works of my predecessors to future generations with love. Silentroom. Special thanks to Silentroom for helping out with the creation of this video. I love the details in this video from the man himself, and I can't thank him enough for allowing me to create something like this. It goes without saying, but please do be sure to support his music. Links to all his platforms are in the description. And one more thing, a composer and friend of mine, Enemy, has started a podcast called The Corner Cab, where we talk about things that happen in the rhythm game world monthly, and also interview artists. And I'm proud to say that I'm a co-host of the show. As of recording, we currently have one discussion episode up, as well as an interview with Billy and Moto, and another with in the works and coming soon. If any of that sounds interesting to you, check it out. Links in the description. That being said, be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed and want to see more, and comment on who you want to see a video on next. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in a bit.